Around the eastern Mediterranean more than 3,000 years ago, a network of kingdoms and cities thrived in ways that might feel unexpectedly familiar. They traded over vast distances, wrote to one another in diplomatic correspondence, relied on complex supply chains, and maintained political alliances that stretched across cultures and seas. Yet within the span of a few decades, this interconnected system unraveled. Great powers fell, trade routes broke down, and whole writing systems vanished from use. Archaeologists call this event the Late Bronze Age collapse. This is the story of how it happened. Between roughly 1500 and 800 years before the Common Era, the peoples of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, and the Levant built a shared world. They managed armies, harvested resources from faraway lands, and depended on each other in ways both obvious and hidden. That interdependence brought centuries of prosperity, but it also created vulnerabilities. Over the course of this documentary, we will follow the rise and fall of that world in 19 steps, tracing its origins, its achievements, and the cascade of pressures that eventually fractured it. We will meet the rulers who tried to hold their realms together, the merchants who kept goods moving, and the migrants who arrived in the wake of collapse. This is not only a record of destruction, it is also a study of how societies adapt, change, and lay the groundwork for what comes next. The Late Bronze Age was a time when the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were bound together in a network of powers, each distinct yet connected through trade, diplomacy, and culture. Between roughly 1500 and 1300 years before the Common Era, this world reached a level of international interaction that was unusual for ancient history. From the Nile Valley to the Anatolian highlands, from the Greek mainland to the Levantine coast, kingdoms and city-states maintained steady contact, exchanging goods, ideas, and political influence. In Egypt, the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom presided over a realm that extended deep into Nubia and reached into the Levant. Pharaohs such as Thutmose III and Amenhotep III sent armies abroad and welcomed envoys from distant lands. Egypt controlled rich agricultural zones along the Nile, as well as gold mines in Nubia and access to luxury goods from far-off regions. These resources gave Egypt the ability to project influence far beyond its borders, and the pharaohs took pride in their position as arbiters of diplomacy in the region. To the north, the Hittite Empire grew into a major power centered in Anatolia. By the time of kings such as Shupalululiuma I in the 14th century before the Common Era, the Hittites controlled large swaths of central Anatolia and extended their authority into northern Syria. Their empire was an intricate patchwork of directly ruled lands and vassal states bound by treaties. The Hittites were formidable militarily, fielding chariot forces and trained infantry, but their real strength lay in diplomacy. They crafted alliances and marriage ties that allowed them to secure borders without constant war. Further east, the kingdom of Mitanni rose to prominence before eventually giving way to the expansion of Assyria. The Mitanni had once dominated much of northern Mesopotamia and Syria, but by this period, they were increasingly challenged by both Hittites and Assyrians. Assyria, still in a phase of growth, would later become a major imperial power, but during the Late Bronze Age, it was one of several states navigating a crowded political landscape. Across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean civilization flourished on the Greek mainland. Mycenae, Tyrants, Pylos, and other palace centers were ruled by kings known as wanaks, who controlled surrounding territories through an administrative system recorded in Linear B script. These palaces were hubs of production, storing agricultural goods, crafting weapons and textiles, and coordinating trade missions across the Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans were active in overseas ventures, establishing connections with Crete, Cyprus, and the Levant. The Levantine coast was dotted with small but influential city-states such as Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and Ugarit. These cities were expert traders, positioned at the intersection of maritime and overland routes. They supplied timber from the Lebanon mountains, luxury goods from inland Syria, and hosted merchants from all over the known world. Ugarit in particular became a vibrant crossroads where Egyptian, Hittite, Cypriot, and Mycenaean traders exchanged goods and news. Cyprus, known in ancient sources as Alashia, was a crucial player in this system because of its copper mines. Bronze, the essential metal of the age, required copper and tin, and Cyprus was one of the most important sources of copper in the region. Its ports bustled with activity as ships carried ingots to markets across the Mediterranean. In return, Cypriot elites imported fine pottery, luxury goods, and agricultural products. This interconnected world was held together by more than just commerce. Diplomacy was a constant feature of the Late Bronze Age. Surviving archives such as the Amarna letters, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the time, reveal the tone and complexity of correspondence between kings. Rulers addressed each other as brother, signifying equal status, and exchanged gifts that ranged from gold vessels to exotic animals. These gifts were not mere tokens. They were political tools meant to strengthen alliances, smooth over disputes, and secure trade. The political stability of the Late Bronze Age relied heavily on these formal relationships. Treaties and alliances allowed powerful states to coordinate responses to threats, such as border raids or rebellions among vassals. Marriages between royal families served a similar purpose, weaving the ruling houses of different lands into a web of mutual obligation. When such ties were honored, the system worked to maintain peace among the great powers, allowing smaller states to thrive under their protection. Economically, this was a time of specialization and long-distance exchange. Raw materials moved from their sources to processing centers, and finished goods traveled even farther to reach their buyers. Tin, for example, might originate in Central Asia, pass through the hands of multiple traders, and finally arrive at a workshop in a Mycenaean palace or a Levantine city. This required trust in partners across great distances and a shared interest in keeping the routes secure. The Late Bronze Age world was also characterized by technological and cultural exchange. Chariot warfare, for instance, spread widely in this period, along with the specialized knowledge needed to build, maintain, and operate chariots effectively. Writing systems and artistic styles also traveled, adapting to local traditions while carrying influences from abroad. Egyptian motifs might appear on Mycenaean pottery, while Hittite religious practices found echoes in the temples of Syria. Yet for all its strengths, this system was not without vulnerabilities. The reliance on long-distance trade meant that disruptions, whether from political unrest, piracy, or environmental changes, could have ripple effects across the entire network. Palace economies, while efficient in organizing production and distribution, concentrated wealth and decision-making in the hands of a few. This made them powerful, but also left them exposed to sudden shocks if leadership failed or resources ran short. From a human perspective, life in the Late Bronze Age varied greatly depending on one's place in the hierarchy. At the top, kings and their courts enjoyed luxury goods, fine clothing, and the prestige of international recognition. Skilled artisans, scribes, and merchants could achieve some measure of prosperity, though their fortunes were tied closely to the stability of the palace system. Farmers and laborers formed the majority of the population, producing the food and raw materials that sustained the entire structure. Their lives were shaped by seasonal rhythms, local obligations, and the demands of rulers who expected taxes and service. Despite these differences, the interconnectedness of the Late Bronze Age meant that events in one region could quickly influence lives in another. A failed harvest in the Levant might lead to higher grain prices in Cyprus. A rebellion in Anatolia could divert Hittite attention from Syria, opening opportunities for rival powers. The system functioned because each part supported the others, But that same interdependence meant that weaknesses could spread just as easily as strengths. By the close of the 13th century before the Common Era, this network had been in place for centuries. Its members had faced conflicts and crises before, yet the system had always managed to recover. Looking at this period in isolation, it is easy to see only stability, diplomacy, and economic success. But the very qualities that made the late Bronze Age world remarkable, its interconnected trade, its reliance on complex administration, and its intricate web of political relationships, would also play a role in what was to come. The late Bronze Age world was not just a map of empires and kingdoms, it was a living network of exchanges that kept goods, information, and influence moving between distant shores. While armies and palaces demonstrated power, the daily reality of this interconnected system relied on something quieter, but just as essential: the constant flow of letters, diplomatic gifts, and commercial cargo. The most direct evidence for these exchanges comes from the archives of royal correspondence, especially the cache of clay tablets found at the Egyptian city of Amarna. Written in Akkadian, the common diplomatic language of the time, these letters reveal the personal tone with which kings and queens addressed one another. They used terms like "my brother" or "my sister" to emphasize equality, even if they privately believed their realm to be superior. Such phrases were not casual. They were part of a carefully maintained etiquette that allowed rulers to negotiate from a position of respect while signaling that both sides benefited from the relationship. These letters covered a range of topics. Some discussed marriages between royal houses, which were more than family arrangements, they were political tools. A princess sent from one court to another could secure an alliance that would last for decades. Others detailed disputes over shipments of goods, delays in the delivery of promised materials, or the treatment of merchants traveling between territories. Each letter, no matter how mundane its content might seem, was part of the machinery that kept the late Bronze Age world connected. Gift exchange was another pillar of this system. These were not simple presents, but deliberate demonstrations of wealth, resources, and craftsmanship. Pharaohs might send gold vessels or fine linen. The Hittite kings might reciprocate with elaborately worked silver or rare horses. The quality and quantity of a gift reflected the status of the sender and the seriousness of the alliance. To send too little could be seen as an insult. To send more than expected could place the recipient in a position of obligation. In some cases, gifts also served as samples for potential trade. An intricately carved ivory box might be a token of friendship, but it also advertised the skills of artisans who could supply more if desired. Beyond the palaces, the commercial web reached deep into everyday life. Merchants, ship captains, and caravan leaders were the invisible agents who kept this network functioning. They carried copper from Cyprus to workshops in the Levant, tin from far-off eastern lands to the foundries of Anatolia, and grain from Egypt to ports in the Aegean. Their journeys crossed political boundaries, requiring familiarity with multiple languages, local customs, and the hazards of long-distance travel. A trader might leave the port of Ugarit with goods bound for Mycenae and return months later with pottery, oil, or textiles for markets at home. Sea routes were especially vital. The Mediterranean's seasonal winds made it possible to plan voyages with relative predictability. Ships could sail north and east during one part of the year, then return south and west when the winds shifted. The cargo capacity of these vessels was impressive for the time. The Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of modern-day Turkey, carried a diverse cargo that included copper ingots, tin ingots, glass, ivory, and luxury goods from at least 7 different regions. It is a striking example of how a single voyage could represent an entire chain of production and trade, linking miners, artisans, merchants, and royal buyers across thousands of kilometers. Land routes were equally important, though they were slower and more dangerous. Caravans crossed deserts and mountain passes to connect inland centers with coastal markets. Pack animals such as donkeys and later camels carried loads of textiles, metals, and exotic goods. These land routes often passed through the territories of multiple rulers, making political stability essential for safe travel. A sudden conflict in one region could close a route entirely, forcing traders to seek longer and more expensive alternatives. The role of intermediaries was critical in this system. Some cities became known as transfer points, where goods were exchanged, repackaged, and sent onward. Ugarit, for instance, not only received goods from ships, but also redistributed them inland toward Mesopotamia. Similarly, certain Anatolian towns acted as gateways between the Hittite heartland and the Aegean coast. These centers developed their own merchant classes, who often served as informal diplomats, smoothing over disputes between foreign traders and local authorities. Economically, this web of trade allowed regions to specialize. Cyprus could focus on copper production without needing to grow all its own grain. Egypt could export surplus agricultural products in exchange for materials it lacked, such as timber or high-quality silver. This specialization increased efficiency and encouraged innovation as artisans and farmers refined techniques to meet the demands of distant markets. However, the same interdependence that created prosperity also created risk. A shortage of tin in one part of the network could disrupt bronze production across multiple kingdoms. If political unrest in one region delayed grain shipments, other areas might face famine. The smooth operation of the system required not only cooperation between rulers, but also the relative safety of trade routes, conditions that could not always be guaranteed. One telling aspect of this period is the way rulers viewed merchants and trade. Far from being left to operate entirely independently, commerce was often under royal oversight. Palace officials might grant permission for certain ships to sail, or issue documents guaranteeing safe passage through allied territories. In some cases, the palaces themselves organized and funded trade missions, sending their own representatives to purchase goods abroad. This close involvement ensured that the wealth generated by trade flowed back into the royal treasuries, strengthening the state's ability to maintain its power. The web of trade also carried ideas and cultural influences. Artistic motifs, religious symbols, and even language elements traveled alongside physical goods. Egyptian-style amulets might be found in Levantine port towns, while Aegean-style pottery could appear in palaces deep within Anatolia. This blending of cultural markers not only reflected the movement of artisans and merchants, but also the openness of certain societies to adopt foreign styles and integrate them into local traditions. From a political perspective, the trade network reinforced the bonds between states. The delivery of goods promised in diplomatic agreements was more than an economic transaction. It was a sign of trust and reliability. When a shipment arrived on time and in good condition, it strengthened the relationship between sender and receiver. When it did not, it could strain that relationship, sometimes with lasting consequences. Letters from the Amarna archive show rulers expressing frustration over late or missing shipments, or complaining that the quality of a promised gift was not as expected. Such disputes could escalate if they intersected with other political tensions. The scale of this network was extraordinary for its time, but it was not limitless. Its efficiency depended on a balance between cooperation and competition. States competed for influence, access to resources, and favorable trade terms, yet they cooperated enough to keep the routes open and the goods flowing. This delicate balance was sustainable for generations, but it left little margin for error when multiple stresses arose at once. In many ways, the network of letters, gifts, and trade was the glue that held the late Bronze Age together. It allowed distant kingdoms to interact without constant warfare, encouraged economic growth through specialization, and fostered cultural exchange that enriched the societies involved. Yet it also tied these societies together so tightly that when pressure came, the strain could travel along the same lines that once carried wealth and friendship. Beneath the smooth exchange of letters and the steady movement of trade lay the engines that powered the late Bronze Age world, the palace economies and the military systems that defended them. In every major kingdom, the palace was not just the ruler's residence. It was the administrative center, the heart of production, storage, and distribution, and the command post for armies that relied on complex supply chains. Palace economies were a distinctive feature of this period. In Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, and the wealthy city-states of the Levant, the palace oversaw the collection of taxes, both in goods and in labor. Farmers brought grain, oil, and livestock to central storehouses, often as part of a fixed obligation rather than a market exchange. Artisans produced goods, pottery, textiles, weapons, furniture, under palace direction, either working in workshops attached to the palace complex or in satellite production centers. These goods could be used locally, sent as tribute to more powerful rulers, or traded abroad to obtain resources that the kingdom lacked. The Mycenaean palaces, for example, left behind detailed records on clay tablets in Linear B script. These records list quantities of grain, wine, oil, livestock, and manufactured goods, along with notes on distribution to various officials and laborers. This administrative control allowed the rulers to ensure that key personnel, scribes, soldiers, craftsmen, were supported year-round, regardless of seasonal fluctuations in agricultural production. In the Hittite heartland, similar organization can be inferred from the survival of large storage facilities and references in royal edicts to the duties of local governors. This system created stability but also dependency. A farmer who gave part of his harvest to the palace in exchange for protection and access to storage could weather a bad year if the palace redistributed surplus. But if the palace failed due to invasion, internal revolt, or mismanagement, the support system collapsed, and the effects were felt immediately across the social hierarchy. Military power was another core function of the palace. Late Bronze Age armies were not large by modern standards, but they were complex, and their most prestigious arm was the chariot corps. Chariot warfare had spread widely in the centuries before this period, and by the 15th century, before the Common Era, it was a symbol of elite status across the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. The chariot was not a simple vehicle. Constructing one required skilled carpenters, leather workers, and metal workers. The frame had to be light yet strong, the wheels perfectly balanced, and the harnesses fitted to specially trained horses. Maintaining a corps of chariot warriors meant maintaining teams of horses, fodder supplies, spare parts, and trained drivers and archers. In Egypt, for example, records from the reign of Thutmose III and later kings list the numbers of chariots and horses kept in royal stables, as well as the officials responsible for their upkeep. The tactical role of the chariot varied by region. In the open plains of Syria and Mesopotamia, chariots served as mobile archery platforms, able to harass enemy formations from a distance and quickly reposition. In the narrower valleys and hill country of the Levant or Greece, they were used more sparingly, often as a shock force or to transport elite warriors to the battlefield. The Hittites developed heavier chariots with room for 3 crew members, driver, shield bearer, and archer, offering more protection and sustained firepower in battle. Chariots were also symbols of prestige beyond the battlefield. In diplomatic exchanges, horses and chariots could be sent as valuable gifts. A king who received fine horses from a distant ally gained both a military asset and a visible sign of his place in the international hierarchy. In some treaties, the provision of chariots or horses formed part of the agreed terms, reinforcing military cooperation between states. Supporting such military systems placed heavy demands on the palace economy. Horses needed specialized fodder, often grown on estates set aside for that purpose. Armor, weapons, and chariot parts required high-quality materials and skilled labor. Campaigns meant organizing large-scale logistics, grain for soldiers, feed for animals, equipment for repairs. This logistical complexity could not be managed without a central authority, and it tied the military closely to the administrative machinery of the state. The link between palace and army also extended into the social sphere. In many kingdoms, chariot warriors were drawn from the nobility or from families with hereditary military service. Serving in the chariot corps was not only a military duty, but a mark of elite status. These warriors enjoyed privileges at court, received land or other rewards from the palace, and participated in the ceremonial life of the state. In return, they owed loyalty to the ruler and readiness to mobilize at short notice. This concentration of military and economic power in the palace created a highly centralized system. The benefits were clear: coordinated production, controlled distribution, and a trained military force ready for deployment. The risks were equally clear. If the palace suffered a crisis, whether from defeat in war, internal rebellion, or a natural disaster, the disruption spread instantly through both the economy and the army. The same centralization that allowed efficiency also meant there was little room for local initiative or independent resilience. From a wider perspective, palace economies and chariot warfare reinforced the interconnectedness of the late Bronze Age world. The need for horses, chariot parts, and specialized metals encouraged trade and diplomatic contact. Treaties between great powers often included clauses about mutual defense, which in practice meant coordinating chariot forces or supplying each other with resources for military campaigns. The prestige of the chariot as a shared elite symbol also strengthened cultural links between distant regions. Yet this interdependence came with hidden costs. The more kingdoms invested in their chariot corps, the more they depended on secure supply lines for horses, fodder, and equipment. Disruptions in one part of the network could ripple through military readiness. Likewise, the palace economy's reliance on predictable agricultural surpluses and steady trade made it vulnerable to environmental shifts or interruptions in the flow of goods. In the centuries between 1500 and 1300 years before the Common Era, these systems worked remarkably well. Palaces administered their lands, stored and redistributed resources, maintained strong armies, and projected power both at home and abroad. Chariot forces gave rulers a decisive tool for both defense and the assertion of dominance. But the same strengths that made this model so successful would later become weaknesses when the stability of the late Bronze Age began to erode. By the dawn of the 13th century, before the Common Era, the late Bronze Age system had already endured centuries of expansion, diplomacy, and occasional conflict. Yet this was also a period when the map of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East began to shift in ways that subtly and sometimes sharply altered the balance between powers. Rivalries that had once been contained by treaties or mutual benefit grew sharper, and contested borderlands became points of friction rather than cooperation. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire reached the height of its territorial extent under the reigns of kings like Mursili II, Muwatalli II, and Hattusili III. The Hittites had spent generations consolidating their hold over central Anatolia, but now their ambitions stretched south into northern Syria. Control of this region was not simply a matter of prestige. It was vital for securing trade routes that linked Anatolia to the Levant and for gaining access to agricultural and timber resources. Cities like Kadesh and Aleppo became focal points of Hittite foreign policy, as their possession could determine who dominated the overland corridor between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. To the south, Egypt's new kingdom also sought influence in these same territories. The great confrontation between Pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, fought around the middle of the 13th century before the Common Era, symbolized the stakes of this rivalry. Although both sides later claimed victory, the battle ended without a decisive change of borders, leading eventually to one of the first known peace treaties in history. Still, the fact that two of the late Bronze Age's superpowers had met in open conflict over control of Syrian lands was a sign that diplomacy had limits when strategic interests were at stake. Meanwhile, in the lands to the east, Assyria began to reassert itself as a regional power. Emerging from a period of relative weakness, Assyrian kings like Adad-nirari I extended their influence westward into territories that the Hittites and Babylonians considered within their spheres. Although Assyria did not yet have the capacity to challenge the Hittite or Egyptian empires directly, its growing military capability added a new layer of competition to an already crowded geopolitical landscape. Border fortresses, garrison towns, and watchtowers were established or reinforced, and the movement of caravans through contested zones now required more careful negotiation or armed escort. On the western edge of the late Bronze Age world, the Mycenaean kingdoms of the Greek mainland also began to project their presence more forcefully into the eastern Aegean and western Anatolia. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Miletus and Troy suggests that Mycenaean elites had established connections, whether through trade, settlement, or military expeditions, that brought them into closer contact with both Anatolian states and the fringes of the Hittite realm. In Hittite archives, there are references to a land called Ahiawa, which many scholars associate with the Mycenaean Greeks. These texts indicate occasional cooperation, but also disputes over coastal territories and influence over smaller states caught between larger rivals. The Levant, wedged between Egypt to the south and the Hittites to the north, felt the pressure of these rivalries most directly. Many of its city-states were vassals or client kingdoms to one empire or the other, and shifts in allegiance could draw swift retaliation. A change in the leadership of a small city might prompt the arrival of foreign troops, either to secure loyalty or to punish perceived disloyalty. Local rulers had to navigate a dangerous diplomatic game, promising tribute and military support to their overlords, while trying to maintain enough autonomy to act in their own interest. This sharpening of rivalries had practical consequences for the functioning of the late Bronze Age system. Armies needed to be maintained at higher readiness, placing greater strain on palace economies. Fortifications along disputed borders were expanded or improved, requiring additional labor and resources. Trade caravans and merchant fleets were sometimes delayed or diverted to avoid contested regions, increasing costs and reducing the reliability of supply chains. The heightened competition also affected diplomacy. While letters continued to flow between royal courts, they increasingly contained veiled warnings or demands alongside the usual pleasantries and gift exchanges. A shipment of luxury goods might be accompanied by a request for military assistance, or by an explicit reminder of obligations under an existing treaty. In some cases, marriages between royal houses, which had once been purely instruments of alliance, became more urgent and transactional, intended to secure a partner's support in an ongoing conflict rather than to cement a long-term peace. For local populations, these changes could be disruptive. Farmers in frontier zones might find themselves pressed into service as laborers for new defensive works or compelled to provide food for passing armies. Towns near contested borders could be raided by one side or the other, not always as part of a full-scale war, but as a means of undermining the opponent's control. Refugees from such raids might flee into neighboring territories, adding to the social and economic strain on communities that took them in. Despite these tensions, the system as a whole still held together during this period. The Hittites and Egyptians ultimately chose to formalize their peace after years of rivalry, producing a treaty that pledged mutual defense and non-aggression. This agreement stabilized the northern Levant for a time, allowing trade to resume more freely and reducing the immediate risk of another large-scale battle between the two powers. In the Aegean and western Anatolia, Relations between Mycenaeans and Anatolian states remained a mixture of competition and cooperation, with neither side yet willing or able to commit to prolonged war. However, these rivalries revealed an important truth about the late Bronze Age world. Its stability was not the product of unshakable unity, but of a balance between competing forces. When that balance tipped too far in favor of one side, or when external shocks disrupted the equilibrium, the entire system risked falling into conflict. The increased militarization of border zones, the overlapping ambitions of multiple powers, and the growing strain on economic and diplomatic resources all pointed to a more fragile future than the apparent prosperity of the period might suggest. By the final decades of the 13th century before the Common Era, this balance was being tested more frequently. Minor conflicts flared along trade routes, alliances were reshuffled, and the margins for error in managing both military and economic systems grew thinner. While the great powers still possessed the means to project strength and maintain their influence, they were increasingly reactive to threats, leaving less room for the careful diplomacy and long-term planning that had sustained the network in earlier centuries. As the 13th century before the Common Era moved toward its final decades, the interconnected system of the Late Bronze Age began to experience a series of disturbances along its western and southern edges. These disruptions did not yet bring down the great powers, but they forced states to divert attention and resources toward defense and security in ways that hinted at deeper vulnerabilities. In the western reaches of the eastern Mediterranean, increased reports of maritime raiding began to reach royal courts. Coastal towns in the Aegean and along the Anatolian shore complained of ships arriving without warning, seizing goods, and sometimes carrying off people. Unlike traditional wars between kingdoms, these raids were not tied to formal declarations of conflict or clear political demands. They appeared opportunistic, carried out by small, fast-moving groups who could vanish back into the open sea before organized retaliation could arrive. The origins of these raiders are difficult to trace with certainty, but Egyptian and later Hittite sources began to refer to loosely organized confederations of maritime peoples. Among the names recorded in Egyptian inscriptions were the Sherdun and Shekelesh, groups who would later be associated with the larger phenomenon of the Sea Peoples. At this stage, however, they were not invading in massed armies. Instead, they harassed shipping lanes, disrupted local markets, and probed coastal defenses. In the southern Mediterranean, Egypt faced a different but related challenge. The Libyan tribes along the western frontier of the Nile Delta began to increase their activity, moving in larger numbers and pressing into Egyptian-controlled territory. Pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled in the years immediately after the death of Ramesses II, confronted a major Libyan-led incursion during his reign. According to inscriptions from his mortuary temple at Thebes, the Libyans were accompanied by allies from some of the same maritime groups known to be active in the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. This suggests that the lines between land-based tribal movements and seaborne raiders were beginning to blur, with alliances forming across considerable distances. The Egyptian victory over the Libyans during Merneptah's reign temporarily secured the delta, but it came at a cost. Mobilizing for large-scale defense required the recall of troops stationed in the Levant and the redirection of resources from other parts of the empire. These defensive efforts strained Egypt's administrative and economic systems, as grain supplies and weaponry had to be gathered quickly and distributed to multiple fronts. Even a victorious campaign against such threats could leave a state financially and logistically weakened in the aftermath. For the Hittites, the western frontier posed its own problems. Western Anatolia had long been home to a patchwork of semi-independent states and coastal settlements whose allegiance to the Hittite Great King was often more nominal than absolute. Raids by Aegean-linked groups, combined with unrest among these coastal communities, forced the Hittites to commit troops to the region at a time when they were also maintaining garrisons in northern Syria. Correspondence from Hittite officials mentions difficulties in keeping order and securing the movement of goods through these zones, which were critical for connecting Anatolia to the Aegean and beyond. The Mycenaean kingdoms, though not the targets of Libyan land incursions, were not immune to the growing instability at sea. Evidence from coastal fortifications in parts of Greece and the islands suggests that some settlements reinforced their defenses during this period, perhaps in response to the same kind of raids that were troubling Anatolia. The construction of these defenses required both labor and materials, drawing on the resources of palace economies that were already managing complex obligations at home and abroad. These disturbances had a cumulative effect on the late Bronze Age system. Maritime trade, which depended on predictable shipping schedules and safe harbors, became riskier. Merchants might choose to delay voyages until after the raiding season, leading to shortages in some markets and surpluses in others. Insurance against loss, whether in the form of higher prices or military escorts, raised the cost of trade. Coastal cities, once open and outward-facing, began to invest more in walls and watchtowers, signaling a shift toward defensive priorities. The alliances forming between different groups of raiders and migrants were particularly troubling to established powers. Whereas a single tribe or pirate band could be dealt with through a show of force or a targeted punitive raid, coalitions were harder to dislodge. They could draw on wider pools of manpower, share knowledge of shipbuilding and navigation, and coordinate attacks across multiple points. The Egyptian accounts of Merneptah's campaign describe not just a single battle, but a coordinated effort to repel a multi-ethnic force, suggesting that the dynamics of conflict were changing. For ordinary people in coastal regions, these early shocks could be life-altering. A fishing village raided for its stored grain, or a merchant caravan robbed on a coastal road, could lose the means to survive the year. Displacement of families from raided settlements added to the pressure on nearby towns, which had to absorb refugees at the same time as they prepared for their own defense. The flow of goods into inland regions slowed, and the variety of imported products that had once been a hallmark of the late Bronze Age began to narrow in some areas. It is important to note that these were not yet signs of complete collapse. The great powers were still able to muster armies, protect key territories, and engage in diplomacy. The trade network, though strained, still functioned, and cultural exchange continued. But the pattern was shifting. Defensive campaigns, counter-raids, and the fortification of vulnerable points were consuming more of the resources that might otherwise have been used for expansion or internal development. The early decades of the 12th century before the Common Era would see these pressures deepen as environmental challenges and resource vulnerabilities began to interact with the military and political strains already visible. In particular, the dependence on a single, distant source for one of the essential ingredients of bronze, tin, would emerge as a critical weakness, making the entire system more sensitive to disruption. This is where our story turns next. Bronze was the defining material of the late Bronze Age. Its strength, durability, and workability made it indispensable for weapons, tools, armor, and countless everyday items. Yet bronze did not occur naturally. It was an alloy, created by combining copper, abundant in regions like Cyprus, Anatolia, and parts of the Levant, with a far rarer ingredient, tin. Without tin, copper remained a softer metal, suitable for certain uses but far inferior for weaponry and heavy-duty tools. This reliance on tin created one of the most significant vulnerabilities in the entire late Bronze Age system. The rarity of tin was not merely a matter of limited sources. The known deposits in the ancient world were scattered and often located far from the centers of late Bronze Age civilization. Some of the richest tin mines lay in distant parts of Central Asia, in regions that today would be considered remote from the Mediterranean. Other potential sources existed in the eastern highlands of Anatolia, parts of the Iranian plateau, and possibly as far west as the Iberian Peninsula. In each case, tin had to travel great distances through multiple intermediaries before it reached the smiths, who would combine it with copper. This journey from mine to market was complex and risky. Tin could pass through the hands of several different groups: miners, local traders, caravan leaders, and maritime merchants, before reaching a palace storehouse or workshop. Every step introduced the possibility of delay, theft, or loss due to conflict or environmental hazards. The palatial economies depended on the assumption that these chains would remain unbroken, an assumption that was difficult to guarantee even in the best of times. Tin's scarcity also gave it a value out of proportion to its size or weight. A small quantity could command high prices, and controlling its flow meant wielding considerable influence. In some regions, rulers attempted to monopolize the tin trade, directing it through specific ports or requiring it to be sold only to state-approved buyers. Such measures ensured that the palaces retained control over bronze production, but they also concentrated risk. If one route failed or one supplier faltered, the shortage could quickly spread through the entire production system. The effects of a tin shortage could be severe and immediate. Without tin, workshops could not produce bronze weapons in the necessary quantities, weakening armies that relied on them. Agricultural tools, such as bronze plowshares and sickles, also suffered, reducing farming efficiency and, in turn, harvest yields. Even luxury goods, ornaments, vessels, and ceremonial items depended on bronze, meaning that shortages could also undermine the symbolic and diplomatic functions of the palaces. The international nature of the tin trade made it particularly vulnerable to political disruption. A war in one distant region could block a crucial land route. A rebellion along a caravan path could make merchants hesitant to travel through it. Maritime piracy, already an increasing concern in the later 13th century before the Common Era, could intercept shipments before they reached their intended ports. Because tin often moved in relatively small, high-value consignments, it was an attractive target for raiders. Moreover, the difficulty of securing reliable tin supplies placed pressure on the broader network of alliances. If one kingdom found itself short of tin, it might appeal to an ally for emergency shipments, requests that could strain even the closest diplomatic relationships if the allies' own supplies were limited. In times of tension, states might even withhold tin as a form of economic leverage, forcing rivals to negotiate from a position of weakness. The palace economies responded to these challenges in several ways. Some attempted to stockpile tin when supplies were good, building reserves in their storehouses. Others sought to diversify their supply lines, encouraging trade from multiple sources so that the loss of one route would not be catastrophic. However, these measures could only mitigate, not eliminate, the risk. The distances were simply too great, and the number of links in the chain too many for any kingdom to be entirely secure. There is evidence that knowledge of tin sources and trade routes was guarded closely. Control over this information was itself a form of power. Merchants and caravan leaders who knew the locations of reliable suppliers could command high fees for their services. In some cases, this secrecy may have contributed to the fragility of the system. If a key intermediary disappeared through death, conflict, or relocation, the knowledge of a particular source or route could vanish with them, cutting off a supply that might otherwise have been sustained. In the broader context of the Late Bronze Age, the tin problem was not just an economic concern, it was a strategic one. Military capability depended heavily on bronze weaponry, and the ability to equip an army with swords, spears, and armor could determine the outcome of both battles and negotiations. States that could maintain steady tin supplies had an advantage not only on the battlefield, but also in the political sphere, where the display of military readiness was often as important as its actual use. This dependence on a single, rare resource also serves as a reminder that even the most advanced societies can be constrained by the limits of their environment and technology. The Late Bronze Age states had achieved remarkable feats in trade, administration, and diplomacy. But they could not create tin where none existed. Their reliance on distant sources was a calculated gamble, one that worked for centuries but left them exposed when broader disruptions began to ripple through the system. By the early 12th century, before the Common Era, the pressures on the tin trade would begin to intensify, interacting with other stresses, climate fluctuations, shifting political alliances, and the rise of new threats on land and sea. The delicate balance that had kept bronze production steady would be increasingly hard to maintain. The late Bronze Age system, already under strain from shifting political rivalries, maritime insecurity, and the fragile tin trade, faced an entirely different kind of threat in the decades around 1200 years before the Common Era. This challenge did not come from an army or a fleet. It came from the natural environment, slow-moving but relentless changes in climate, years of crop failure, and a period of intense seismic activity that historians sometimes refer to as earthquake storms. Climate evidence, drawn from sediment cores, pollen analysis, and studies of ancient plant remains, suggests that parts of the eastern Mediterranean began to experience a marked decline in rainfall during the late 13th and early 12th centuries before the Common Era. This was not an isolated dry year, which most societies could endure through stored reserves and trade. Rather, it appears to have been a period of multi-year drought, in some areas lasting decades. Reduced rainfall meant reduced crop yields, and in societies where agriculture formed the backbone of the economy, even a modest decline could trigger serious consequences. The impact of drought varied by region, but its effects often spread beyond the areas where the rain failed. A kingdom that normally exported grain might suddenly need to keep more of it at home, leaving trading partners without a vital import. Cities that depended on incoming food from the countryside or from overseas found their supplies growing irregular and more expensive. The palace storehouses, designed to smooth out the highs and lows of agricultural cycles, were not limitless. Once reserves ran low, even the most powerful states had to make difficult decisions about how to allocate dwindling resources. Inscriptions and letters from the period bear witness to the human toll of these shortages. In Ugarit, correspondence from the final years of the city's existence includes urgent requests for grain from allies, with notes about the dire situation facing the population. Egyptian sources from the reign of Merneptah and later Ramesses III refer to Libyan and other foreign groups moving into Egyptian territory in part to seek better land and resources, movements that may have been encouraged by deteriorating conditions in their home regions. Famine was not only a humanitarian disaster, it was a political one. Hungry populations were more likely to rebel, flee, or seek out new leaders who could promise relief. The cost of feeding urban centers or armies during a famine could drain royal treasuries, forcing rulers to reduce spending in other areas such as defense, infrastructure, or long-distance trade. In vassal states, famine could weaken loyalty to an overlord, especially if the promised aid failed to arrive. While drought and famine undermined the agricultural foundation of late Bronze Age societies, seismic activity attacked their physical infrastructure. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a complex system of fault lines, and in certain historical periods, it has experienced clusters of powerful earthquakes within relatively short spans of time. Archaeological evidence from sites across Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Cyprus suggests that the decades around 1200 years before the Common Era saw repeated episodes of destruction caused by earthquakes. In some cities, collapsed walls and crushed buildings show the telltale signs of seismic damage rather than burning from warfare. Layers of rubble and fallen masonry indicate that the destruction was sudden, with no time to salvage goods or prepare defenses. At times, the same city appears to have been struck more than once within a generation, giving rise to the idea of an earthquake storm, in which seismic energy was released along connected fault lines in a series of large quakes. The consequences of such destruction went beyond the immediate loss of life and property. Rebuilding a palace, temple, or major city wall required immense labor and materials, resources that might already have been stretched thin by drought or military commitments. In smaller states, repeated quakes could erode the ability of the ruling elite to maintain control, as the population lost faith in their leadership or simply abandoned damaged settlements for safer ground. The combination of environmental stresses created a feedback loop. Drought reduced harvests, leading to famine. Famine weakened populations, making it harder to recover from disasters such as earthquakes. Earthquake damage, in turn, destroyed storage facilities, granaries, and irrigation systems, making it even more difficult to manage food shortages. All the while, the political and economic demands of maintaining armies and supporting the trade network continued, drawing on the same limited resources needed for recovery. Migration was one of the most visible human responses to these crises. In times of famine or repeated earthquake damage, communities sometimes chose to leave their home regions entirely. These movements could be small, families relocating to nearby towns, or large-scale, involving entire groups seeking new territories. Such migrations often brought newcomers into contact, and sometimes into conflict, with established populations, adding another layer of instability to already fragile political arrangements. The environmental crises of this period also altered the strategic priorities of the great powers. Securing access to reliable food supplies became as important as controlling trade routes or military strongholds. This could mean annexing fertile lands, forming new alliances with grain-producing regions, or stationing troops to guard agricultural zones from raids and rival claimants. In some cases, it meant drawing back from distant commitments in order to focus on feeding the home population, a choice that could leave allies feeling abandoned. Religious and cultural responses to these disasters are harder to trace, but likely played a role in shaping events. In societies where the ruler's legitimacy was tied to their ability to ensure the prosperity of the land, prolonged drought or repeated earthquakes could be interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. This might prompt increased offerings to temples, the building of new shrines, or the elevation of new religious leaders claiming to have the favor of the gods. In extreme cases, it could fuel political upheaval if the ruling dynasty was seen as having lost that favor. By the middle of the 12th century, before the Common Era, the cumulative weight of these environmental challenges had begun to reshape the late Bronze Age world. While the system had survived previous droughts, famines, and earthquakes, the scale and persistence of these particular events, combined with the other political and economic pressures already in motion, created a level of strain from which recovery would be difficult. The stage was now set for a series of political and military collapses that would sweep through the interconnected kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean. While environmental stress, trade disruptions, and shifting political alliances unsettled the wider Late Bronze Age world, the Greek mainland experienced a particularly sharp and irreversible transformation. The Mycenaean civilization, centered around its fortified palaces, had been one of the pillars of the interconnected Eastern Mediterranean system. Yet, within a few decades, its great citadels lay in ruins, its administrative systems vanished, and its long-distance connections faltered. This collapse was not a single event, but a series of blows that dismantled the political, economic, and cultural structure that had defined Mycenaean Greece for centuries. The Mycenaean world was organized around a network of palatial centers: Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, and several others, each ruled by a wanax, or king. These centers coordinated agricultural production, craft specialization, and trade. Their scribes recorded transactions in the Linear B script, an administrative system that linked local estates to the palace's central storehouses. Archaeology shows that these palaces were not only political capitals, but also manufacturing hubs, producing textiles, weapons, and luxury goods destined for both local use and foreign markets. By around 1200 years before the Common Era, signs of trouble began to appear. At Pylos, located in the southwest Peloponnese, the final Linear B tablets record urgent preparations for a military threat along the coast. These records mention the mustering of troops, the dispatch of watchers to specific points, and the allocation of resources for defense. The tone suggests immediate danger, yet within a short time, the palace itself was destroyed by fire and never rebuilt. Mycenae, the namesake city of the civilization, also suffered destruction in this period. The citadel's massive fortification walls, which had long symbolized power and security, could not prevent the burning of key structures. Excavations reveal layers of ash and collapsed masonry in the palace complex, pointing to a violent and catastrophic event. Similar patterns are found at Tiryns and Thebes, indicating that this was not an isolated disaster, but part of a wider wave of palace destructions. The causes of these events remain the subject of debate among historians and archaeologists. Warfare, whether from external raiders or conflicts between rival palatial states, is one possibility. The fortified nature of these centers and the military preparations recorded at Pylos suggest that armed threats were real and pressing. Some scholars argue that the collapse may have involved coordinated attacks by groups linked to the wider disruptions occurring across the eastern Mediterranean, possibly including elements of the maritime raiders active in this era. Internal strife may also have played a role. The concentration of wealth and authority in the palace elite created social tensions, especially in times of scarcity. If environmental stresses, reduced agricultural yields, or trade disruptions limited access to essential goods, resentment toward palace authority could have escalated into rebellion. Such uprisings, perhaps combined with opportunistic attacks from outside, might explain the simultaneous destruction of multiple centers. Natural disasters could have compounded these pressures. Earthquake damage is evident in some Mycenaean sites, and the broader pattern of seismic activity during this era makes it plausible that quakes weakened defenses or triggered fires. However, the sheer scale and frequency of destruction across the mainland suggests that earthquakes alone cannot account for the political and administrative collapse that followed. Whatever the precise combination of causes, the results were dramatic. The palatial system that had coordinated production, distribution, and foreign trade ceased to exist. Linear B writing disappeared as there was no longer a centralized bureaucracy to maintain it. Artisans who had worked for the palace lost their patrons, and specialized industries that relied on palace oversight and long-distance exchange either contracted severely or vanished. Population patterns also shifted. Some settlements were abandoned outright, while others shrank in size and complexity. In certain regions, people moved from the fertile plains into more defensible hilltop sites, suggesting a heightened concern for security. These smaller communities lacked the surplus production and administrative reach of the palaces, focusing instead on subsistence farming and local exchange. The loss of the palatial centers also meant the loss of their role as political mediators. In the palace era, disputes between communities could be managed through the authority of the wanaks, who controlled both military force and economic resources. Without that central authority, power fragmented. Local leaders, perhaps chiefs or influential families, emerged to fill the vacuum, but their influence was limited to their immediate territories. Internationally, the disappearance of Mycenaean palaces disrupted established trade networks. Mycenaean pottery, once common across the eastern Mediterranean, became rarer in foreign markets. Contacts with Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt diminished. The Mycenaean presence in western Anatolia and the islands faded, opening the door for other powers and populations to fill the gap. For the people of Greece, the collapse marked the end of a way of life. The monumental architecture, the organized bureaucracy, and the far-reaching political influence of the palaces were gone. In their place emerged a more rural, localized society, one that relied less on distant trade and more on the resources of the immediate landscape. This transformation did not mean that culture vanished entirely. Some traditions persisted in modified form. Pottery styles evolved rather than disappearing, and certain religious practices appear to have continued at smaller shrines and sanctuaries. Oral traditions may have preserved memories of the palace era, eventually contributing to the epic tales of heroes and wars that would be written down centuries later. But the centralized, literate, and internationally connected Mycenaean world had ended. The fall of the Mycenaean palaces also had consequences beyond Greece. Their absence altered the balance of power in the Aegean and reduced one of the key participants in the late Bronze Age trade and diplomatic system. This change rippled outward, affecting Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Levant, where other powers had to adjust to the disappearance of a long-standing partner and sometimes rival. By the middle of the 12th century before the Common Era, the Greek mainland was no longer home to the great palatial states that had shaped its history for centuries. The decline of these centers was one chapter in a wider story of upheaval, but it was among the clearest and most decisive breaks with the past. In the northern Levant, on the coast of what is now Syria, the city of Ugarit had long been one of the most vibrant nodes in the late Bronze Age trade network. Its harbors connected overland caravan routes from inland Syria and Mesopotamia with maritime lanes that reached Cyprus, the Aegean, Anatolia, and Egypt. For centuries, Ugarit thrived as a commercial hub, a cultural crossroads, and a political intermediary between great empires. By the closing decades of the 13th century before the Common Era, it had grown into a wealthy, literate, and cosmopolitan city, yet within only a few years it would vanish, leaving behind a wealth of archaeological evidence, but no living continuation of its traditions. The importance of Ugarit lay in its geography and political role. Situated between the Hittite Empire to the north and Egypt to the south, Ugarit served as a vassal state that shifted allegiance depending on the balance of power. By the later 13th century before the Common Era, it was firmly within the Hittite sphere of influence, bound by treaty to supply goods and military assistance when required. Its ports brought in Cypriot copper, Aegean pottery, Egyptian luxury goods, and Mesopotamian textiles. These goods passed through Ugarit's warehouses and markets, feeding both local consumption and re-export to other destinations. The city was also a center of administration and literacy. Ugaritic scribes wrote in multiple scripts, including cuneiform, Akkadian for international diplomacy, and their own alphabetic cuneiform for local use. The archives recovered from the ruins of Ugarit contain royal correspondence, commercial contracts, legal documents, and even literary texts. They reveal a society deeply engaged with its neighbors, adept at managing complex economic arrangements, and responsive to the shifting demands of diplomacy. Yet these same connections that had brought Ugarit prosperity also tied it to the fate of the wider late Bronze Age system. When that system began to fray, Ugarit's position became increasingly precarious. The city's dependence on maritime trade made it vulnerable to the rise in piracy and raiding that was spreading across the eastern Mediterranean. Its obligations to the Hittite overlords meant that it was drawn into their conflicts, particularly as the Hittite Empire faced mounting pressures from multiple fronts. The most telling glimpse of Ugarit's final days comes from the city's last letters, preserved in its archives. In one tablet, King Amurapi of Ugarit writes to the ruler of Alashia, Cyprus, urgently requesting help. "The enemy ships are here. They have set fire to my cities and done harm to my land. Does not my father know that all my troops are in Hatti, and all my ships are in Lycia?" The letter conveys both the immediacy of the threat and the vulnerability of the city, its defenses weakened by the absence of its forces, which had been dispatched to aid the Hittites. Other letters in the final archive include appeals for grain and supplies, suggesting that the city was already struggling with shortages, perhaps due to the broader drought conditions affecting the region. The combination of food scarcity and military vulnerability left Ugarit dangerously exposed. When the attackers came, most likely a coalition of seaborne raiders and possibly displaced peoples from earlier conflicts, they encountered a city unable to mount a sustained defense. The destruction of Ugarit was swift and total. Archaeological evidence shows widespread burning across the city, from the royal palace to private homes and workshops. Valuable goods were left behind in storerooms, indicating that the inhabitants either fled in haste or were killed before they could evacuate. The suddenness of the destruction is underscored by the preservation of entire archives, which were baked hard by the heat of the fires, and thus survived for archaeologists to discover thousands of years later. With the fall of Ugarit, the northern Levant lost one of its key commercial hubs. The city's role in channeling goods between inland and coastal routes could not be easily replaced. The collapse of this link in the chain disrupted the flow of copper from Cyprus, timber from Lebanon, and luxury goods from the wider Mediterranean into the markets of Syria and Mesopotamia. The political ramifications were equally severe, for the Hittite Empire, already stretched by conflicts in Anatolia and threats along its other borders. The loss of Ugarit meant the loss of a loyal vassal and an important staging point for operations in the Levant. For Egypt, it removed a valuable intermediary that had facilitated trade and communication with northern powers. Ugarit's destruction also accelerated a wider pattern of urban decline in the Levant. Other coastal cities, some larger, some smaller, faced similar threats in these years. In many cases, they too were destroyed or abandoned, whether from direct attack, economic isolation, or the inability to feed their populations during prolonged shortages. Those that survived often did so by retreating from the international stage, focusing on local resources and defense rather than long-distance trade. From a cultural perspective, the loss of Ugarit meant the loss of a distinctive written tradition. The Ugaritic alphabetic cuneiform script, though efficient and well-suited for the local language, did not spread widely beyond its home region. When the city fell, the script effectively disappeared. The city's literature, religious texts, and administrative records were preserved only in the burned ruins, to be rediscovered millennia later. The end of Ugarit illustrates the fragility of cities whose prosperity depends on the stability of a larger system. The same strategic location and diplomatic connections that had made it a vital hub also made it a target when the currents of war and migration shifted. Its destruction was not the result of a single isolated event, but the culmination of pressures, economic, environmental, and military, that converged in the early 12th century before the Common Era. By the time Ugarit fell, other parts of the late Bronze Age network were already unraveling. The collapse of the Mycenaean palaces had removed one important partner from the trade web, and the weakening of the Hittite Empire was becoming increasingly evident. In the heart of Anatolia, the Hittite Empire had stood for centuries as one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age. From its capital at Hattusha, the great king ruled over a vast and diverse realm that stretched from the Aegean coast in the west to the borders of Mesopotamia in the east, and from the Black Sea in the north to the fertile plains of northern Syria in the south. This was an empire built on a delicate combination of military strength, vassal loyalty, and careful diplomacy. But in the decades following the fall of Ugarit, the Hittite system began to unravel at a pace that left little chance for recovery. The late 13th century, before the Common Era, had already placed heavy demands on the Hittite state. Rivalries with Egypt, although tempered by the famous peace treaty signed during the reigns of Hattusili III and Ramesses II, had still required the maintenance of strong armies along the Levantine frontier. Meanwhile, the western provinces of Anatolia had long been restive, with semi-independent states such as those in Arzawa and the Luka lands resisting central control. Beyond these geopolitical challenges, the Hittite heartland was not especially rich in natural resources. To equip their armies and sustain their cities, the Hittites depended on the reliable flow of goods from vassal territories and trading partners, grain from the Levant, metals from Cyprus and beyond, and luxury goods from the Aegean and Mesopotamia. In the years around 1200 years before the Common Era, this system faced a convergence of threats. Climate stress reduced harvests in parts of Anatolia, straining the ability of the central government to feed its population and army. In Syria, the loss of Ugarit and other loyal vassals weakened the Hittite southern frontier and cut off an important source of supplies. Raiding from maritime groups, possibly linked to the wider movements of the so-called Sea Peoples, disrupted coastal provinces and made it harder to maintain contact with Cyprus, a critical source of copper. Perhaps most damaging was the breakdown of internal cohesion. The Hittite Empire was a patchwork of directly ruled provinces and allied or vassal states held together by treaties, personal oaths, and the prestige of the great king. When the empire was strong, these arrangements worked well, allowing local rulers a degree of autonomy while ensuring their loyalty through mutual benefit and the threat of Hittite intervention. But as military defeats mounted and the empire's resources thinned, vassals began to act more independently. Some withheld tribute, others made agreements with rival powers, and still others rebelled outright. The reign of Shupiluluuma II, the last known great king of Hattusha, was marked by attempts to reverse this decline. Inscriptions from his reign record campaigns against coastal enemies and efforts to protect maritime routes, including an engagement at sea that is sometimes considered one of the earliest recorded naval battles in history. But these measures were reactive rather than strategic. Each campaign consumed resources that the empire could no longer easily spare, and the victories, if they could be called that, were temporary at best. The final blow to the Hittite capital appears to have come in the form of direct attack. Archaeological evidence from Hattusha shows that the city was burned and abandoned around 1190 years before the Common Era. The palace and administrative buildings were destroyed, and there is no sign that the city was reoccupied on any significant scale afterward. The identity of the attackers remains uncertain. Possibilities include rebellious vassals from western Anatolia invading groups from the north, or displaced peoples moving through the region during the larger waves of upheaval. Whoever they were, they struck decisively, ending the city's role as the center of imperial authority. The collapse of the Hittite state was rapid and final. Unlike Egypt, which would weather the storms of the early 12th century before the Common Era in a diminished but still recognizable form, the Hittite Empire did not survive in any centralized way. Its former territories fragmented into smaller polities, some ruled by descendants of the old Hittite elite. These so-called Neo-Hittite states, such as those centered at Carchemish and Melid in what is now southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, preserved aspects of Hittite culture, language, and political tradition. However, they operated as independent kingdoms, focused on local concerns rather than on maintaining a vast empire. For the wider Late Bronze Age system, the fall of the Hittite Empire was a severe shock. In northern Syria, the absence of Hittite authority created a power vacuum that neighboring states and incoming groups were quick to exploit. Trade routes that had once been protected by the reach of the great king were now exposed to disruption from both land-based raiders and seaborne attackers. The intricate diplomatic web that had once linked the Hittites to Egypt, Assyria, and the Aegean unraveled, replaced by a more fragmented and unpredictable political landscape. Economically, the loss of the Hittite market and its demand for goods such as copper, tin, textiles, and grain disrupted established production and distribution patterns. Artisans and merchants who had relied on imperial contracts found themselves without buyers, and communities that had prospered by supplying the empire now faced reduced demand and uncertain futures. The weakening of central control also meant that large-scale infrastructure, fortifications, roads, storage facilities was less likely to be maintained or repaired, further eroding the capacity for recovery. The symbolic impact of the Hittite collapse should not be underestimated. For centuries, the Hittites had been one of the recognized great powers of the Near East, named alongside Egypt, Babylonia, and later Assyria in the diplomatic correspondence of the age. Their disappearance from the stage was not only a political fact, but also a sign that the old order was disintegrating. If such a mighty and established empire could fall so completely, then no state could consider itself immune from the forces tearing at the late Bronze Age world. By the early 12th century before the Common Era, the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean had been redrawn. The Greek mainland had lost its palatial states, the Levant had seen its northern commercial hub destroyed, and Anatolia's imperial center was gone. The vacuum left by the Hittites would soon be filled, not by a single successor, but by a shifting patchwork of new powers, migrant groups, and localized states. While the Greek mainland, the Levant, and Anatolia were already reeling from political collapses and military destruction, the island of Cyprus, known in ancient texts as Alashia, was entering its own period of profound change. For centuries, Cyprus had been a cornerstone of the late Bronze Age economy because of its abundant copper deposits. Copper was the primary ingredient in the bronze alloy that defined the era, and Alashia's mines, smelting facilities, and ports supplied kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean. But by the early 12th century before the Common Era, this vital hub was itself disrupted, cutting yet another link in the already fraying chain of the Bronze Age system. Cyprus's strategic importance was twofold. Geographically, it sat in a central position between the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean, allowing it to serve as a maritime crossroads. Economically, it controlled the production and distribution of copper on a scale unmatched by any other region in the late Bronze Age network. Inscriptions and letters from places as far apart as Egypt and Ugarit record shipments of copper ingots from Alashia as part of diplomatic agreements and commercial transactions. These ingots, cast in a distinctive oxhide shape for ease of transport, were loaded onto ships bound for ports where tin could be acquired and bronze could be manufactured in quantity. For much of the 13th century before the Common Era, Alashia appears to have been politically stable and integrated into the wider system. Its kings corresponded directly with Egyptian pharaohs and with rulers of other great powers. The island exported copper in exchange for grain, luxury goods, and prestige items such as fine textiles and jewelry. Skilled artisans in Cypriot towns also produced their own high-quality pottery and metalwork, much of it influenced by Aegean and Levantine styles, which found ready markets abroad. However, Cyprus's central role in the trade system also made it vulnerable to the same forces that were destabilizing its neighbors. By the closing decades of the 13th century before the Common Era, maritime raiders, possibly including some of the same groups troubling the coasts of Anatolia and the Levant, were active in the waters around the island. Shipwreck evidence suggests that vessels carrying copper from Cyprus were prime targets, since their cargo could be sold or traded for essential supplies anywhere in the region. The political situation within Alashia also began to change. Archaeological evidence from several coastal settlements, including in Komi, Kition, and Hala Sultan Teke, shows signs of destruction or significant reorganization during this period. In some cases, the destruction layers suggest burning, possibly from raids or local conflict. In other cases, the changes may reflect deliberate restructuring of urban layouts to emphasize fortification and defense. These shifts hint that the island was experiencing both external attacks and internal adjustments to new security realities. Cultural evidence points to a growing Aegean presence on Cyprus during this time, Pottery styles, architectural techniques, and even certain burial customs show strong Mycenaean influence, likely brought by migrants fleeing the collapse of the Greek palatial centers. These newcomers may have integrated with local communities, adding to the island's diversity, but also potentially complicating its political cohesion. Such demographic changes might have been peaceful in some places and contentious in others, depending on local conditions and leadership. The disruption of copper production and distribution on Cyprus had consequences far beyond the island's shores. For states still reliant on bronze weaponry and tools, the loss or reduction of Cypriot shipments could not be easily offset. Other copper sources existed, but none were as conveniently located or as well connected to established trade routes. The copper shock meant that even if tin supplies could be secured, which was already a challenge, the other essential component of bronze was now harder to obtain. This shortage may have accelerated the adoption of iron in some regions. Iron had been known for centuries, but it was more difficult to smelt and work than bronze, and it had not yet been widely used for weapons or tools. As bronze became scarcer and more expensive, iron began to look like a viable alternative, especially for societies that could no longer count on regular deliveries of Cypriot copper. The shift to iron would eventually define the next era of Mediterranean and Near Eastern history, but in the early 12th century, before the Common Era, it was still an uneven and experimental process. The decline of Cyprus's role as a stable copper supplier also had diplomatic repercussions. Alaşya had long been a valued partner to the great powers because of its resources, and its copper shipments often formed part of formal alliances or tribute arrangements. As those shipments became irregular, the political weight of Alaşya diminished. Kingdoms that had once courted Cypriot favor might now look elsewhere for partners, or turn to coercion to try to secure what copper remained available. Despite these challenges, Cyprus was not entirely abandoned or destroyed during this period. Some settlements recovered after episodes of destruction, often with new urban layouts and different cultural mixes than before. This resilience suggests that while the island was deeply affected by the wider Bronze Age collapse, it also adapted in ways that allowed parts of its population to survive and, in some cases, even to prosper in the new political landscape. Coastal towns continued to trade, though on a reduced scale, and inland communities may have relied more on local agricultural production to sustain themselves. Still, the Alaşya that emerged from this period was not the same as the island that had once been a linchpin of the late Bronze Age trade network. Its copper output was diminished, its political landscape more fragmented, and its role in the international order less assured. For the interconnected system that had defined the preceding centuries, this was yet another rupture, one more strand severed in the web of mutual dependencies. By the time Cyprus's upheaval had run its course, the major powers of the region had been reduced to shadows of their former selves. Only Egypt remained as a recognizable great power, and even it was under mounting pressure. As one great power after another faltered or fell in the decades around 1200 years before the Common Era, Egypt stood increasingly alone, as the last major state still capable of projecting authority across the eastern Mediterranean. Yet Egypt, too, faced the same forces that had swept away the Mycenaean palaces, the city of Ugarit, the Hittite Empire, and the stability of Cyprus. For the pharaohs Merneptah and Ramesses III, the early 12th century before the Common Era was a time of unrelenting military and political challenge. Both rulers confronted invasions on multiple fronts, as well as the internal strains of sustaining a powerful state in an era of scarcity and disruption. Pharaoh Merneptah, who came to the throne in the late 13th century before the Common Era as the son of Ramesses II, inherited an Egypt that still possessed wealth, prestige, and functioning administration. Yet within a few years of his reign, the Western Delta faced a large-scale incursion by Libyan groups. These were not isolated raids by small warbands, but coordinated advances that included allies from maritime peoples active elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Groups such as the Shurden and Shekelesh, whose names would appear again in later conflicts. The Libyans brought their families with them, suggesting an intent to settle rather than merely plunder. Merneptah's inscriptions describe the ensuing battle in vivid terms, claiming a decisive Egyptian victory. The invaders were repelled, and order was restored to the western frontier, at least temporarily. However, the campaign revealed the vulnerabilities of Egypt's position. Mobilizing the army to defend the delta required diverting resources from other regions, weakening Egypt's ability to enforce its influence abroad. Moreover, the scale of the Libyan-led coalition hinted that Egypt's enemies were becoming more organized and more willing to coordinate across cultural and geographical lines. In addition to threats from the west, Egypt under Merneptah also faced instability in Canaan. An inscription from his reign, the famous Israel Stela, records a campaign in the Levant against a coalition of city-states and peoples, including a group identified as Israel. While the inscription presents the campaign as a triumph, the need to conduct such operations underscored that Egyptian authority in the Levant was not as secure as it had been during the high point of the New Kingdom. With the Hittite Empire weakening, Egypt's northern holdings were more exposed to the shifting alliances and population movements destabilizing the region. By the time Ramesses III ascended the throne in the early 12th century before the Common Era, the geopolitical situation had deteriorated further. The new pharaoh, ruling from his capital at Per-Ramesses in the eastern delta, faced the challenge of defending a kingdom whose borders were under near constant pressure. In the 8th year of his reign, Egypt confronted what was perhaps the most famous and dramatic invasion of the late Bronze Age: the arrival of a massive confederation of peoples known collectively to historians as the Sea Peoples. The inscriptions and reliefs at Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu provide a detailed, if highly propagandistic, account of this invasion. According to these records, the Sea Peoples came by both land and sea, bringing their families, carts, and possessions, much like the Libyan coalition of Merneptah's time, but on a far greater scale. Among the named groups were the Peliset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh. They advanced through the Levant, defeating or displacing local polities before turning toward Egypt. Ramesses III prepared for their arrival with a combination of defensive fortifications, strategic troop deployments, and naval readiness. The sea battle depicted at Medinet Habu shows Egyptian ships engaging the invaders in the Nile Delta, using archers to rain arrows on enemy vessels while Egyptian marines boarded and captured them. On land, Egyptian forces met the migrants in pitched battle, reportedly inflicting heavy casualties and taking captives. The pharaoh claimed a total victory, boasting that he had annihilated the invading coalition and resettled the survivors in Egyptian-controlled territories. The Peliset, widely associated with the Philistines of later biblical tradition, may have been among those allowed to settle in southern Canaan under Egyptian oversight. While the triumph was genuine in the sense that Egypt remained unconquered, the effort required to repel such a massive assault was immense. The Medinet Habu inscriptions also mention earlier campaigns in Ramesses III's reign against Libyans, indicating that Egypt had to defend both its western and northern frontiers almost continuously. These repeated military mobilizations placed heavy burdens on the economy and the population. Grain shortages, likely linked to the same droughts affecting the wider region, compounded the strain. In later years of his reign, there is evidence of internal unrest, including a major labor strike at Deir el-Medina, the first recorded strike in history, when workers on royal tombs stopped work to demand overdue rations. Despite these challenges, Ramesses III's reign marked the last time Egypt would successfully project power on a scale comparable to the height of the New Kingdom. His military victories, particularly against the Sea Peoples, preserved the integrity of Egypt's core territories and maintained its status as a major state when most of its peers had already collapsed. However, these victories were defensive rather than expansionist. Egypt no longer had the surplus resources or political stability to undertake long-term campaigns deep into foreign lands, as it had under Thutmose III or Seti I. In the decades following Ramesses III's death, Egypt entered a period of gradual decline. The central government's control over outlying regions weakened, and internal divisions began to emerge between the royal court at Thebes and other centers of power. The pharaonic state had survived the upheavals of the Late Bronze Age, but it was a changed and diminished power, more concerned with preserving its immediate security than with shaping the politics of the wider Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt's survival during this period offers important insights into the dynamics of the Bronze Age collapse. Geography played a role. The Nile Valley was less vulnerable to the kind of overland invasions that devastated Anatolia and the Levant. Administrative continuity also mattered. Egypt retained a functioning bureaucracy capable of mobilizing resources quickly in response to threats. Finally, the ability to integrate defeated groups, as with the resettlement of some sea peoples, allowed Egypt to turn potential enemies into controlled assets, at least for a time. Still, the cost of survival was high, and the kingdom's resilience would be tested again in the centuries to come. In the wake of the great powers' collapse, the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean was redrawn, and new peoples and polities began to emerge in the spaces left behind. The decades following the great military confrontations of the early 12th century before the Common Era were not marked by a simple return to stability. Instead, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a prolonged period of demographic transformation. Large-scale migrations, some sudden and others gradual, reshaped the cultural and political map of the region. Groups that had once been known mainly as raiders or refugees began to settle in new territories, establishing fresh identities and influencing the course of early Iron Age history. One of the most significant of these resettlements occurred in the southern coastal plain of Canaan, where a group identified in Egyptian records as the Peliset, likely related to the people known later as the Philistines, established a cluster of fortified cities. Archaeology at sites such as Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza shows a distinctive material culture emerging in this period, combining elements of Aegean design with local Canaanite traditions. Pottery styles, for example, display decorative motifs similar to those found in the Mycenaean world, but adapted to new forms and techniques. These new communities were not mere temporary encampments. They were permanent urban centers with planned layouts, public buildings, and defensive walls. Their location along the coast gave them access to maritime trade routes, while their inland connections linked them to agricultural hinterlands. The Philistine cities quickly became important regional players, capable of both defending themselves and engaging in trade with neighboring peoples. Over time, they developed their own political structures, often forming loose confederations to coordinate their interests. To the north, the Syrian interior and parts of the former Hittite realm saw the rise of Aramaean groups. The Aramaeans appear in the historical record during this same period as a network of semi-nomadic tribes and clans, many of whom gradually transitioned to settled life in newly established towns. These groups expanded into areas vacated by the collapse of older city-states, sometimes taking over existing settlements and sometimes founding entirely new ones. In the centuries to come, Aramaean states such as Damascus and Beit Adini would play central roles in Near Eastern politics, but their roots lay in this era of migration and reorganization. In the highlands of Canaan, a different process was underway. Archaeological surveys have revealed a sharp increase in the number of small, rural settlements during the early Iron Age, many located in previously uninhabited or sparsely populated areas. These villages were typically modest in scale, with simple houses arranged around open courtyards, and relied heavily on subsistence agriculture and herding. The identity of these highland settlers is debated, but they are often associated with the early Israelites, as referenced in Merneptah's inscription from the previous century. Regardless of exact identity, their emergence represents a significant demographic shift, one that contributed to the eventual rise of new polities in the region. The Phoenician coastal cities, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, also experienced changes during this period. Unlike many of their neighbors, these cities managed to avoid total destruction, perhaps due to their strong maritime orientation and defensible locations. As the disruptions of the Late Bronze Age forced a reorientation of trade networks, the Phoenician ports became increasingly important as intermediaries. They welcomed not only local merchants, but also migrants from other regions whose skills and connections enriched the city's economic and cultural life. Over the next centuries, the Phoenicians would become renowned for their seafaring and trade, laying the foundations for a commercial expansion that would reach far beyond the eastern Mediterranean. On Cyprus, the influx of people from the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant during the same period added to the island's already diverse population. These settlers brought new styles of pottery, architecture, and religious practice, blending with existing Cypriot traditions to create a distinctive hybrid culture. Some coastal towns rebuilt after earlier destruction, incorporating stronger fortifications and more organized street plans, suggesting a growing awareness of the need for defense in a still volatile environment. This era of migration and resettlement was not solely the result of military defeat or environmental pressure. For some groups, movement was an opportunity as well as a necessity. The collapse of major empires and the weakening of long-standing borders created openings for ambitious leaders to carve out new territories. Migrants could establish themselves in fertile lands, occupy strategic trade routes, or take control of previously prosperous towns whose earlier rulers had fallen. In some cases, incoming groups assimilated into existing societies. In others, they maintained a distinct identity for generations, influencing the political and cultural development of their new homes. The transformation of identity was a gradual but powerful process. Groups that had been labeled by outsiders, such as the Sea Peoples, often adopted new self-definitions once they settled. The Philistines of Canaan, for example, developed a shared material culture and political alignment that set them apart from both their Aegean forebears and their Canaanite neighbors. The Aramaeans, initially a loose tribal confederation, evolved into a constellation of small kingdoms with their own urban centers and ruling dynasties. These changes reflected not only the adaptation to new environments, but also the forging of new political and social relationships. Trade networks, though still disrupted, began to adapt to the new realities. Migrant-founded cities often served as fresh nodes of exchange, linking inland agricultural zones with coastal markets. In some cases, migrants brought knowledge of distant routes or specialized crafts that gave them an advantage in rebuilding long-distance trade. The Philistine cities' access to both Mediterranean shipping and inland caravan routes is a good example of this adaptability. Nevertheless, the migrations also brought new tensions. Competition for land and resources could lead to conflict between settlers and established populations. In Canaan, for instance, the arrival of the Philistines added a new dimension to the already complex interplay between Egyptian authority, local city-states, and emerging highland communities. In Syria, the spread of Aramaean groups often put them at odds with the remnants of the Neo-Hittite states and with Assyrian ambitions in the region. The political landscape of the eastern Mediterranean by the end of the 11th century before the Common Era was markedly different from that of the Late Bronze Age. The great empires of the 13th century were gone, replaced by a patchwork of smaller kingdoms, tribal confederations, and independent cities. Many of these were products of the migrations and resettlements of the preceding decades. The shift from a few centralized powers to a more fragmented political order would define the early Iron Age, bringing both instability and opportunities for innovation. The political and economic collapse of the coastal and Anatolian powers reverberated far inland, reaching even the ancient heartlands of Mesopotamia. Although the cities of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys were spared the direct assaults of the Sea Peoples or the burning of their capitals, the same interconnected system that had once brought them prosperity now carried instability into their domains. The early Iron Age in Mesopotamia was defined by sudden shifts in power, foreign incursions, and the challenge of maintaining authority in a world where long-distance order had been shattered. Babylon, the venerable city on the Euphrates, had been under Kassite rule for several centuries before the crisis. The Kassite dynasty had managed to keep Babylon relatively stable through careful diplomacy, balancing relations with the Hittites, Egyptians, and Assyrians, while benefiting from the flow of trade that crossed the Near East. However, with the collapse of the Hittite Empire and the decline of Egypt's overseas presence, the delicate balance that had preserved Kassite Babylon's autonomy broke apart. In the mid-12th century before the Common Era, the Elamites, an ancient people based to the east in what is now southwestern Iran, launched a decisive attack on Babylon. The Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunta captured the city, carried off its treasures, and took the Kassite king into captivity. This was more than a mere military raid. It was the symbolic dismantling of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. The Elamites even removed important cult statues, including that of the god Marduk, an act that struck at the spiritual heart of Babylonian identity. The fall of the Kassite dynasty created a power vacuum in southern Mesopotamia. Although Babylon itself would later be retaken by local rulers, it never regained the same degree of stability or influence during this period. The constant threat of renewed Elamite aggression and the growing presence of Aramaean tribes along its western approaches forced Babylonian rulers to focus on immediate defense rather than on ambitious statecraft or cultural projects. Further north, Assyria experienced its own cycle of rise and contraction. Under kings such as Tiglath-Pileser I in the late 12th century before the Common Era, Assyria had briefly reasserted itself as a major regional power. Tiglath-Pileser campaigned westward into Syria, even reaching the Mediterranean coast, and claimed control over key trade routes and timber resources. His inscriptions boast of hunting lions, conquering rebellious cities, and sailing on the Great Sea, projecting the image of a king capable of restoring the grandeur of the past. Yet this resurgence was short-lived. By the early 11th century before the Common Era, Assyria faced mounting difficulties. Aramaean groups, whose migrations had reshaped Syria and parts of the Levant, began to push into Assyrian territory along the Middle Euphrates and the Habur River Valley. These groups were adept at mobile warfare and could strike quickly at settlements and trade routes, making them difficult to suppress with traditional siege and field tactics. Assyrian kings responded by building and reinforcing fortresses along key frontier zones, attempting to contain the incursions. However, such defensive measures required significant resources, troops to garrison the forts, supplies to keep them operational, and the ability to rapidly deploy forces to trouble spots. This strain on the Assyrian state was compounded by environmental challenges, including fluctuations in rainfall that affected agricultural output in the Assyrian heartland. The combined pressure of defending against Aramaean infiltration, maintaining control over distant territories, and managing internal resources eventually forced Assyria to contract its sphere of influence. By the middle of the 11th century, before the Common Era, The empire's reach had been reduced largely to its core territory in northern Mesopotamia, while Assyria remained an organized and militarily capable state. It no longer commanded the network of vassals and trade routes that had fueled its earlier expansion. The Aramean advance into Mesopotamia was not merely a military phenomenon. As these groups settled in conquered or abandoned lands, they established new communities, often integrating with or displacing local populations. Over time, they would become a dominant cultural and linguistic presence across much of the Near East. The spread of the Aramaic language, which in later centuries would become a lingua franca of the region, had its roots in this period of migration and settlement. For the economies of Mesopotamia, the aftershocks of the late Bronze Age collapse meant the breakdown of many long-distance commercial links. The supply of luxury goods from the Mediterranean dwindled, and even essential raw materials such as copper and tin became harder to obtain in predictable quantities. Cities that had relied on imported timber for construction now had to turn to more local and often inferior sources. In some areas, craft production declined in quality or shifted towards simpler, locally available materials. Religious life, too, was affected. In Babylon, the absence of the statue of Marduk after the Elamite conquest disrupted the central New Year festival, a key moment in the city's ritual calendar and political identity. The eventual return of the statue, possibly through diplomatic negotiation or later military action, was celebrated as a restoration of divine favor. But the period of absence left a deep mark on Babylonian memory. In Assyria, kings continued to invest in temple construction and restoration, but the scale of such projects was reduced, reflecting the more constrained resources of the era. Despite the contraction of centralized states, the cultural and political fragmentation of Mesopotamia did not lead to total collapse. Agricultural production in the river valleys continued, supported by the enduring irrigation systems that had been developed over millennia. Local rulers maintained city governance, and trade persisted on a smaller, more regional scale. The resilience of these core systems allowed Mesopotamia to survive the upheavals and eventually to serve as a foundation for future political revivals. By the later 11th century before the Common Era, the political map of the Near East was one of fragmentation. Neo-Hittite states dotted the landscape of southern Anatolia and northern Syria. Aramaean kingdoms were emerging across the Levant and Mesopotamia. Babylon was reduced to a regional power, and Assyria was confined to its northern heartland. Into this fractured world would come new technological and social developments that would transform warfare, agriculture, and trade. In the centuries following the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces, the Greek mainland entered a prolonged period of reduced complexity and diminished population that later scholars came to call the Dark Age. This term, coined in reference to the scarcity of written records and monumental architecture, can be misleading if taken to mean cultural stagnation. While the era from roughly 1100 to 800 years before the Common Era did see a retreat from the urbanization and bureaucratic administration of the palatial period, it was also a time of adaptation, experimentation, and gradual social reorganization. The first and most immediate consequence of the palatial collapse was the loss of centralized administration. With the disappearance of the linear B writing system, record-keeping reverted to oral tradition. Economic transactions were handled locally, without the meticulous documentation that had characterized Mycenaean bureaucracy. This shift meant that political power became far more decentralized. Instead of a single wannix presiding over a network of dependent towns, authority rested in the hands of smaller-scale leaders, chieftains or local headmen, whose influence was confined to a particular community or region. Population decline was another defining feature of the early centuries of the Dark Age. Archaeological surveys indicate that many settlements were abandoned, particularly those in coastal and lowland areas. This depopulation may have been driven by a combination of factors: the destruction of trade routes, repeated conflict, food shortages, and the lure of more defensible inland locations. The communities that remained were typically smaller and more dispersed, with fewer large-scale building projects and less specialization in crafts. Material culture reflects these changes. Pottery styles of the period, such as the so-called proto-geometric ware, were simpler in decoration compared to the elaborate designs of the Mycenaean era. The quality of craftsmanship declined in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, suggesting a loss of specialized artisans and access to imported materials. Over time, however, new styles and techniques emerged, indicating a slow but steady recovery in skill and aesthetic ambition. One of the most significant technological changes of the Dark Age was the increasing use of iron. As the supply of bronze dwindled due to the disruptions in copper and tin trade, Greek smiths began to experiment more widely with iron, which was available from local sources. Initially, ironworking produced tools and weapons of uneven quality, as the techniques for smelting and forging were still developing. By the later stages of the Dark Age, however, iron had become the primary metal for utilitarian objects, offering communities a more reliable resource for both agriculture and warfare. The social fabric of Greek life during this period was shaped by the household and the village. Agricultural production relied on small family plots, supplemented by herding and seasonal foraging. Cooperation among households was essential for tasks such as harvesting, building storage facilities, or defending against raids. Leadership was likely based on a combination of lineage, personal skill, and the ability to command loyalty in times of conflict. Without the overarching structure of the palatial administration, these local leaders were free to pursue their own strategies for survival, whether through alliances, intermarriage, or competition with neighboring communities. Cultural continuity was maintained through oral tradition. Without a writing system to record laws, treaties, or literature, memory and performance became the primary means of preserving the past. Epic poetry, genealogies of ruling families, and stories of heroic deeds were passed down from generation to generation by bards and storytellers. These narratives served not only as entertainment, but also as a means of reinforcing communal identity, moral values, and historical legitimacy. The tales that would later form the Homeric epics almost certainly drew on this reservoir of oral tradition, preserving distant memories of the Mycenaean age in a transformed cultural landscape. Religious practices also adapted to the new realities. While the monumental temples of later Greek civilization had not yet been built, sacred spaces, often simple outdoor altars or small shrines, remained central to communal life. Many of these sites may have had Mycenaean precedents, but their scale and organization reflected the reduced resources of the period. Rituals and offerings were conducted to honor local deities, ancestral spirits, or natural forces, reinforcing social cohesion and shared identity in communities that could not depend on centralized political institutions. By the 9th century before the Common Era, signs of gradual recovery began to appear. Population levels stabilized and in some regions started to grow. Pottery styles became more elaborate again, with the geometric style introducing complex patterns and motifs. Trade contacts slowly expanded, first on a regional basis between neighboring islands and coastal communities, and later reaching further afield into the eastern Mediterranean. This resurgence of exchange brought new ideas, materials, and techniques, laying the groundwork for further development. The revival of overseas contact during this period was particularly important for the eventual reintroduction of writing. Sometime in the 8th century before the Common Era, the Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet to suit their language, creating a new script that would become the foundation of Greek literacy. This innovation marked the end of the purely oral tradition and opened the way for the recording of laws, treaties, and literature. It also symbolized Greece's reintegration into the larger Mediterranean cultural sphere, now in a very different form from the late Bronze Age system. The political structures of the emerging Greek world differed significantly from those of the Mycenaean era. Instead of centralized kingdoms, the basic unit of organization became the polis, or city-state, which combined urban, rural, political, and religious functions within a defined territory. The origins of the polis lay in the village networks of the Dark Age, where local autonomy and mutual dependence had been the norm. As trade and population increased, these communities could support more complex forms of governance, leading to the varied political experiments of the Archaic and Classical periods. While the term Dark Age emphasizes the losses of the post-Mycenaean centuries, loss of writing, monumental architecture, long-distance trade, it is equally important to recognize the resilience and adaptability that characterize this era. Communities reorganized themselves in ways that suited the new realities, developed new technologies like ironworking, preserved cultural memory through oral tradition, and laid the institutional foundations for the political and cultural achievements of later Greek civilization. By the time the Greek world re-entered the historical record in the 8th century before the Common Era, it was a very different society from the one that had built the palaces of Mycenae and Pylos. The kings of the Wanex tradition were gone, replaced by a more fragmented, locally driven political landscape. Yet from this more modest foundation, Greece would eventually produce some of the most influential institutions, philosophies, and artistic traditions of the ancient world. While much of the eastern Mediterranean lay in political fragments after the great disruptions of the Late Bronze Age, a cluster of small but determined city-states along the Levantine coast not only survived, but steadily adapted to the changed world. These were the Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and a number of smaller ports, whose history during the early Iron Age is a testament to resilience, innovation, and strategic use of geography. In a period when many former powers had turned inward to protect what little they retained, the Phoenicians began to reassert themselves outwardly, rebuilding maritime trade networks and introducing a new tool that would shape communication across the ancient world: the alphabet. The survival of the Phoenician cities was due in part to their geography. Nestled between the mountains of Lebanon and the Mediterranean Sea, they were protected from large-scale overland invasion by difficult terrain, yet they could project influence and sustain trade across the sea. The coast offered a string of natural harbors, and the nearby mountains provided abundant timber, especially the famed cedars of Lebanon, which had been prized since the time of the Egyptian pyramids. This combination of defensibility and valuable resources gave the Phoenician cities a strong starting position as they emerged from the disruptions of the 12th century before the Common Era. Another reason for their resilience was their political structure. Each city was an independent state ruled by its own king and elite merchant families. This political decentralization meant that the fall of one city did not doom the others, and it allowed for a diversity of responses to changing circumstances. While the cities could be rivals, they also cooperated when mutual benefit was clear, especially in matters of maritime trade and defense against common threats. In the early centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, the Phoenician cities rebuilt their fleets and re-established commercial connections. Unlike the large territorial empires of the previous era, the Phoenicians did not seek to dominate vast inland territories. Instead, they focused on controlling the flow of goods along the coast and across the sea. Their ships sailed to Cyprus, the Aegean, and Egypt, carrying timber, purple-dyed textiles, glass, and crafted metal goods. In return, they imported grain, metals, and luxury items. Their approach to commerce was flexible and opportunistic. Phoenician traders were known to establish small coastal outposts, serving both as resupply stations and as points of exchange with local communities. These were not full-fledged colonies at first, but they laid the groundwork for the more extensive network of settlements the Phoenicians would later build across the Mediterranean. This adaptability allowed them to thrive in an era when long-distance trade had to be rebuilt piece by piece. One of the most significant contributions of the Phoenicians to the ancient world during this period was the development and spread of their alphabetic writing system. Earlier scripts, such as cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, required mastery of hundreds of signs, each representing words or syllables. The Phoenician script, by contrast, used a small set of symbols, each representing a consonantal sound that could be combined to write many different words. This made learning to read and write far easier and faster, expanding the potential for literacy beyond the narrow class of professional scribes. The origins of the Phoenician alphabet can be traced to earlier consonantal scripts used in the region, but the Phoenicians refined and standardized the system, making it more practical for everyday use in trade and administration. As Phoenician merchants traveled, they carried the script with them. In the Aegean, it was adapted by the Greeks, who added symbols for vowel sounds, creating the foundation of the Greek alphabet. From there, the alphabetic principle would eventually spread to the Latin script and many others, influencing writing systems still in use today. The introduction of the alphabet had profound economic implications. Contracts, inventories, and correspondence could be recorded more easily, allowing merchants to conduct complex transactions without relying entirely on memory or oral agreements. In societies where goods might be shipped hundreds of kilometers by sea and land, the ability to document obligations and deliveries was a powerful advantage. Phoenician shipbuilding also played a key role in their resurgence. The cedar forests of Lebanon provided strong, rot-resistant timber for hulls and masts, while advances in design allowed for ships that were both sturdy and maneuverable. The Phoenicians are credited with developing bireme vessels, ships with 2 levels of oars, that improved speed and control, making them effective for both trade and defense. Such technological advances gave Phoenician traders an edge over rivals and allowed them to navigate routes that were difficult for less well-equipped mariners. The religious and cultural life of the Phoenician cities also contributed to their cohesion. While each city had its own patron deities and cults, they shared a broadly similar pantheon and ritual structure, which helped maintain a sense of cultural unity. Temples often served as both religious and economic centers, holding wealth, hosting diplomatic gatherings, and even participating in trade ventures. By the 10th century before the Common Era, the Phoenician cities had become indispensable players in the emerging early Iron Age trade system. They were not the only seafarers. Greek and Cypriot ships also plied the Mediterranean, but they had the advantage of deep experience, valuable resources, and a network of contacts stretching from the Levant to the Western Seas. The growing influence of the Phoenicians also had political consequences. While they preferred commerce to conquest, their wealth made them attractive allies and tempting targets for larger powers. In the coming centuries, the Phoenician cities would navigate a complex diplomatic landscape, balancing tribute and autonomy in their dealings with empires such as Assyria. For now, in the 9th and 10th centuries before the Common Era, they enjoyed a period of relative independence and prosperity that contrasted sharply with the struggles of many other regions in the post-Bronze Age world. The Phoenicians' ability to adapt, to rebuild their fleets, to innovate in communication, and to leverage their natural resources made them one of the great success stories of the early Iron Age. Yet their story was also a reminder that the world had changed irrevocably. The era of massive, centralized empires dominating the entire eastern Mediterranean was over, replaced by a more fragmented, competitive, and entrepreneurial system in which smaller states could thrive if they played their strengths wisely. The centuries following the Bronze Age collapse were marked not only by political realignments and demographic shifts, but also by a fundamental transformation in technology. This change, gradual at first, but ultimately far-reaching, was the widespread adoption of iron as the primary metal for tools, weapons, and agricultural implements. Iron had been known and occasionally worked for centuries before the collapse, but it was during the early Iron Age that it began to supplant bronze on a broad scale. This shift reshaped economies, altered the balance of military power, and opened opportunities for societies that had not been major players in the earlier bronze-based system. Bronze had dominated the Late Bronze Age because of its superior qualities for casting, its strength compared to pure copper, and the skill of the metallurgists who could produce it in large quantities. Yet bronze required two components, copper and tin, that were not evenly distributed across the ancient world. Cyprus and parts of Anatolia supplied copper, but tin was far rarer, often sourced from distant lands in Central Asia, the Iranian Plateau, or possibly even as far away as the western edges of Europe. Maintaining bronze production meant maintaining long-distance trade routes, secure shipping lanes, and political relationships capable of guaranteeing steady supply. The collapse of these systems after the 12th century before the Common Era made bronze more difficult to produce and more expensive to obtain. Iron, by contrast, was far more abundant in nature. Iron ore deposits could be found in many regions of the Near East, the Aegean, and beyond. The challenge with iron was not scarcity, but the complexity of working it. Unlike copper, which could be melted at relatively low temperatures, iron required higher heat to smelt and did not cast as easily. Early ironworking involved labor-intensive forging and hammering to remove impurities, and the resulting metal was often less consistent in quality than bronze. However, once the techniques for smelting and forging iron were refined, the advantages of its availability became decisive. The spread of iron technology during the early Iron Age was uneven. Some regions adopted it quickly, while others clung to bronze for ceremonial or elite purposes, even after iron had become common in daily life. In many societies, bronze continued to be used for decorative items, luxury goods, or certain specialized tools, while iron was reserved for utilitarian objects. Over time, however, iron's durability and lower cost of production made it the material of choice for weapons and farming equipment alike. The military implications of this shift were profound. In the Late Bronze Age, the expense of bronze weaponry had limited the size of well-armed forces, concentrating military power in the hands of palace-based elites who could afford to equip and maintain specialized units, such as chariot corps. In the Iron Age, the relative accessibility of iron meant that larger numbers of soldiers could be equipped with durable swords, spears, and armor. This change favored infantry forces over elite chariot warriors, and contributed to a more diverse and flexible battlefield composition. Infantry armed with iron weapons could hold their own against forces that once relied on the mobility and shock value of chariots. This did not mean that chariots disappeared overnight. They remained valuable in certain terrains and for specific tactical purposes, but their dominance as the defining weapon of elite warfare waned. In many regions, the decline of the chariot corps paralleled the decline of the palace-centered aristocracies that had supported them. The military became more grounded in the collective strength of foot soldiers, which in turn affected the social and political organization of emerging states. Agriculture also benefited from the introduction of iron tools. Iron plowshares and sickles were stronger and more durable than their bronze counterparts, allowing farmers to work heavier soils and expand cultivation into new areas. Improved agricultural productivity could support larger populations, promote settlement growth, and free some members of the community from subsistence farming to pursue crafts, trade, or military service. This increased productivity was particularly significant in regions recovering from the population declines and economic contractions of the post-collapse period. The spread of iron technology did not happen in isolation. Knowledge of smelting techniques, forging methods, and the handling of iron ores moved along trade routes and through the migration of peoples. In some cases, incoming groups brought ironworking skills with them. In others, local artisans adapted existing methods to new materials. The Phoenicians, with their far-reaching maritime connections, likely played a role in transmitting ironworking knowledge between regions, just as they had with other technological and cultural innovations. One striking aspect of this period is how the adoption of iron coincided with broader shifts in political power. Regions that had been peripheral in the bronze-based system could now compete more effectively. Without the need for long-distance tin supplies, smaller states and even local communities could produce their own weapons and tools, reducing dependence on the international trade networks that had been the lifeblood of the late Bronze Age. This technological democratization contributed to the more fragmented but also more competitive political landscape of the early Iron Age. The symbolic dimension of iron was also important. In some cultures, iron acquired an association with strength, resilience, and even divine favor. Myths and legends from the early Iron Age sometimes frame the mastery of iron as a gift from the gods or as a marker of a people's rise to prominence. This perception reinforced the material advantages of iron with a layer of cultural prestige, making it not just a practical tool, but a symbol of progress and identity. Despite its growing prevalence, iron did not instantly erase the prestige of bronze. In many societies, bronze continued to hold ceremonial significance, and elite objects, ornamental weapons, vessels, and regalia were still crafted from the older alloy. The coexistence of bronze and iron in this period reflects the gradual nature of technological change. Only over generations did iron fully displace bronze as the dominant metal in both practical and symbolic contexts. By the end of the first millennium, before the Common Era's first few centuries, iron had become a defining feature of the new Mediterranean and Near Eastern order. States that mastered iron production and distribution gained a decisive edge in both war and economic development. This advantage would shape the rise of new powers in the coming centuries, from the Neo-Assyrian Empire to the Greek city-states and beyond. The adoption of iron, then, was more than a technological shift. It was a catalyst for social, economic, and political transformation. It helped create the conditions for a more interconnected yet more competitive world, one in which military might was less tied to a small elite and more accessible to a broader segment of society. In this sense, iron was both a product of the post-Bronze Age world and a force that propelled it into its next phase. By the dawn of the 9th century before the Common Era, much of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East had settled into a new geopolitical reality. The great empires of the late Bronze Age were gone, replaced by a mosaic of smaller kingdoms, tribal confederations, and city-states. Yet this apparent fragmentation was not permanent. Over the course of the next 2 centuries, several states developed the political structures, military capacity, and economic networks needed to dominate vast territories once again. Chief among these was the Neo-Assyrian Empire, whose rise heralded a new era of imperial control, an era shaped by iron weaponry, advanced siege techniques, and unprecedented administrative sophistication. The transformation began in Assyria, which had contracted to its northern Mesopotamian heartland after the pressures of the 12th and 11th centuries before the Common Era. For generations, Assyrian kings had defended their core territory from Aramaean incursions, preserving their military traditions and administrative institutions even during times of reduced power. By the early 9th century before the Common Era, rulers such as Ashur-nasirpal II began to reverse the pattern of retreat. Using a reformed army equipped with iron weapons and supported by a standing corps of professional soldiers, the Neo-Assyrian kings launched campaigns first to secure nearby territories and then to push outward into the Levant, Anatolia, and Babylonia. One of the keys to Assyria's resurgence was its mastery of siege warfare. The Assyrians developed sophisticated techniques for breaching city walls, including battering rams, siege towers, and sappers who tunneled beneath fortifications. Combined with their reputation for ruthless treatment of rebels, including mass deportations, their military prowess made resistance costly for opponents. As the empire expanded, conquered populations were relocated in large numbers, both to weaken rebellious regions and to supply labor for agriculture, construction, and military service. This policy of mass deportation had lasting consequences. It brought diverse peoples into close contact within the empire, fostering cultural exchange, but also creating new social tensions. For the Assyrian state, however, it served both economic and political goals. Resettled populations revitalized underdeveloped areas, and their dispersion reduced the likelihood of coordinated revolts in their homelands. The Neo-Assyrian administration was equally formidable. Governors appointed by the king oversaw provinces, collecting tribute, enforcing laws, and maintaining infrastructure. Royal roads and communication networks allowed for rapid transmission of orders and intelligence across the empire's vast territory. Tribute from subject states, including grain, livestock, metals, and manufactured goods, flowed into the Assyrian heartland, sustaining both the army and monumental building projects in cities such as Kalhu, Nimrud, and Nineveh. Assyrian dominance inevitably affected the political fortunes of neighboring regions. In the Levant, small kingdoms such as Israel, Judah, Aram Damascus, and the Philistine cities found themselves alternately resisting and submitting to Assyrian demands for tribute. In some cases, alliances were formed to oppose Assyrian expansion, but the empire's military superiority often ensured eventual victory. Coastal Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon negotiated their survival by providing naval support, luxury goods, and steady payments, maintaining a degree of autonomy in exchange for loyalty. In Anatolia, the patchwork of Neo-Hittite states that had emerged after the Hittite collapse gradually fell under Assyrian influence or direct control. Some were annexed outright, others became tributary states, their rulers allowed to remain in power so long as they acknowledged Assyrian supremacy. This incorporation of Anatolia reconnected the empire to important metal resources and strategic trade routes. In Babylonia, the relationship with Assyria was more complex. Babylon retained immense cultural prestige, and Assyrian kings often sought legitimacy by taking the title King of Babylon alongside their other royal titles. However, Babylonian resistance to Assyrian rule was frequent, leading to cycles of rebellion and reconquest. Despite these tensions, Assyria's control over Babylonia was critical for access to southern Mesopotamia's agricultural wealth and trade links to the Persian Gulf. While Assyria emerged as the dominant military and political power, it was not the only state to thrive during this period. In the Levant, the Kingdom of Israel reached the height of its territorial extent under rulers such as Omri and Ahab, engaging in trade and occasional military alliances with neighboring states. To the south, the Kingdom of Judah remained smaller, but maintained a distinct political and religious identity. Further north, Urartu, a kingdom centered in the highlands around Lake Van, became a formidable rival to Assyria for control of eastern Anatolia and the Caucasus. In the western Mediterranean, the Phoenicians embarked on a new phase of expansion. Drawing on their maritime expertise, they established colonies along the coast of North Africa, southern Iberia, and islands such as Sardinia and Malta. These outposts served as trading hubs and resupply stations, extending Phoenician influence far beyond the Levant. Carthage, founded during this period, would in time become one of the most powerful cities in the Mediterranean. The Greek world, too, began to stir from the relative obscurity of the post-Mycenaean centuries. In the 8th century before the Common Era, population growth, renewed trade, and the adoption of the alphabet set the stage for the emergence of the polis system. Greek city-states established colonies across the Aegean and into the western Mediterranean, participating once again in long-distance trade and cultural exchange. Agricultural expansion underpinned much of this broader recovery. The spread of iron tools improved farming efficiency, enabling larger populations and supporting urban growth. In regions under imperial control, such as Assyria's provinces, state-directed agricultural projects, including irrigation canals and new settlements, boosted productivity and ensured steady supplies for armies and cities. Culturally, the 9th and 8th centuries before the Common Era were a time of synthesis. Artistic styles, religious practices, and technological innovations crossed political boundaries through trade, diplomacy, and the movement of peoples. Assyrian reliefs depict Phoenician ships, Levantine tribute bearers, and exotic animals from distant lands, illustrating the empire's role as a hub in a network of exchange that reached from the Caucasus to the Mediterranean and beyond. By the close of the 8th century before the Common Era, the Near East had entered a new phase of political centralization and military competition. The Neo-Assyrian Empire stood at its zenith, dominating a territory larger than any state the region had seen since the height of the Late Bronze Age. Yet the very scale of its success carried seeds of future instability. Maintaining control over such a vast and diverse realm required constant military campaigns, heavy tribute demands, and a level of administrative coordination that left little room for error. The pressures that had undone the empires of the Bronze Age had not vanished. They had merely shifted in form. Looking back across the centuries that spanned the height and fall of the Late Bronze Age, it becomes clear that no single event or cause can fully explain the scale and scope of the collapse. The disintegration of the interconnected world that had stretched from Egypt through the Levant, Anatolia, the Aegean, and Mesopotamia was the result of multiple forces acting together, sometimes reinforcing one another, sometimes compounding damage in ways that no single state could have anticipated or withstood. The end of this era was less like a single building falling in an earthquake, and more like an entire city's foundations slowly giving way while tremors, storms, and fires swept through at the same time. One of the defining characteristics of the Late Bronze Age was its high degree of interdependence. Great powers such as Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, and Babylon, as well as influential smaller states like Ugarit and Al-Ashia, were connected through an elaborate network of trade, diplomacy, and shared technologies. This system allowed for prosperity and cultural exchange, but it also created vulnerabilities. When one part of the network faltered, the consequences could ripple outward, affecting regions far removed from the initial disturbance. Environmental factors played a critical role in destabilizing this system. Evidence from climate studies suggests that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged period of reduced rainfall, beginning in the late 13th century before the Common Era. This was not a single-year drought that could be weathered through stored reserves or short-term trade. It was a multi-decade shift in climate patterns. Crop yields fell, herds weakened, and food prices rose. For societies already dependent on complex administrative systems to collect and redistribute resources, such as the palace economies of the Aegean and Anatolia, the strain was severe. Famine was both a humanitarian disaster and a political one, eroding public confidence in rulers and forcing hard choices about who would be fed and who would be left to fend for themselves. Simultaneously, the tectonic instability of the region appears to have entered an active phase, with archaeological evidence pointing to multiple earthquakes, sometimes in close succession, striking urban centers. Such earthquake storms damaged infrastructure, destroyed storehouses, and in some cases may have triggered fires that consumed entire palace complexes. Rebuilding required labor, materials, and organization, all of which were harder to muster in times of economic hardship and political uncertainty. On top of these environmental pressures came human conflict in forms both familiar and unprecedented. Traditional warfare between rival states continued, as in the clashes between Egypt and the Hittites over Syrian territories, but these were joined by new waves of mobile, unpredictable enemies. The groups later known collectively as the Sea Peoples were not a single unified nation, but a shifting coalition of maritime raiders, displaced migrants, and opportunistic warriors. Their attacks on ports, shipping lanes, and coastal cities disrupted the flow of goods and severed the lifelines of states dependent on imported resources. Migrations were not limited to the sea. Overland movements of peoples, such as the spread of Aramaean groups into Syria and Mesopotamia, placed additional pressure on established states. Some of these migrations were driven by environmental hardship, others by the collapse of neighboring powers. But in every case, they altered the demographic and political balance in the regions they entered. Settlers and invaders alike often moved with their families, indicating that they were seeking new homes rather than simply plundering and withdrawing. Economic fragility amplified the damage. The Late Bronze Age system relied heavily on a few critical resources that were geographically limited. Chief among these was tin, essential for making bronze. With tin sources far from the Mediterranean and reliant on long, multi-stage trade routes, any disruption in supply could halt bronze production. Cyprus provided much of the copper, but when the island itself was attacked and reorganized during the collapse, even that resource became less reliable. The shortage of bronze weapons and tools further weakened states already struggling to maintain military readiness and agricultural output. The political structures of the time were ill-suited to absorb these shocks. Palace economies concentrated wealth, authority, and production in a single center, which was efficient in good times but dangerously brittle in crisis. When a palace burned, was abandoned, or lost control over its hinterland, the entire administrative system collapsed with it. Without a functioning palace, there was no mechanism for collecting and redistributing surplus, no authority to coordinate defense, and no way to maintain the specialized production that had supported elite lifestyles and long-distance trade. Diplomatic ties, so crucial to the stability of the Late Bronze Age, also unraveled. The elaborate gift exchanges, marriage alliances, and treaty obligations that had once bound the great kings together became liabilities when states could no longer fulfill their promises. A shipment of grain delayed by famine, or a consignment of copper lost to piracy, could strain relations between allies. Once trust broke down, the willingness to come to one another's aid diminished. What is striking is how quickly the system moved from apparent stability to irreversible collapse. In the span of a few decades, roughly from 1200 to 1150 years before the Common Era, major palatial centers in the Aegean were destroyed. Ugarit was burned. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned. Cyprus was transformed by destruction and migration, and Egypt fought for its life against massive invasions. The sequence of events was not identical in every region, but the overall pattern was unmistakable. Once the system began to fail, it failed everywhere. Yet the collapse was not the end of history. The centuries that followed saw the rise of new cultures, technologies, and political forms. Iron replaced bronze as the dominant metal, reducing dependence on vulnerable trade routes. Smaller, more flexible political units emerged in place of sprawling empires, and some of these, such as the Phoenician city-states, used the new conditions to expand their influence. Oral traditions preserved the memory of the old world in transformed form, eventually giving rise to epic literature and new cultural identities. In this sense, the Late Bronze Age collapse was both an end and a beginning. It ended an era of extraordinary interconnectedness and imperial grandeur, but it also cleared the ground for the Iron Age civilizations that would dominate the first millennium before the Common Era. The lessons of this transformation remain relevant. Complex systems are powerful, but they are also vulnerable when too many of their parts fail at once. environmental change can undermine even the most sophisticated economies, and societies that adapt quickly to new realities can emerge stronger from periods of crisis. The world that arose from the ashes of the Late Bronze Age was different in almost every respect from the one that had preceded it, less centralized, more diverse, and shaped by new technologies and new peoples. Yet, in the long arc of history, the collapse and recovery together formed a single story, the story of how human communities respond when the structures they have long depended on can no longer hold.